In the previous two videos in this series on Operation Keelhaul, we heard the history of Operation Keelhaul itself and learned why the Allies and the Soviets perpetrated this crime. If you haven't seen those videos, you need to watch them first, links in the description. In this third video, we're going to take a look at some of the counter-arguments against the idea that Operation Keelhaul even happened, or if it did, whether it was a true crime or not. And we'll look into other various arguments too. Some of these counter-arguments are genuine counter-arguments or concerns over Operation Keelhaul's legitimacy as a historical event, and I will agree with some of them too, while others, I would say, are just simply invalid dismissals of evidence that goes against people's beliefs. Interestingly though, most of the arguments I've received weren't the ones I was expecting, but I am actually in a position to counter them, so that's what I'm going to do today. I just want to quickly start off by highlighting this comment which said, "Tick, I don't give an S what anyone else says, you are the best online historian out there. The level of detail in your videos is fantastic. Stop listening to these clowns criticising you. You challenge their preconceived notions of history and it makes them butthurt." I often get told to ignore the trolls, and I get that. However, I can't just ignore the counter-arguments. History lies in the heart of the debate. Even if they're arguing from a place of ignorance, I still need to address them, because they could be right. Plus, given the nature of the subject, I fully expected a backlash from the beginning, and if I hadn't, I wouldn't have planned for this to be a multi-part series. It may have only been a two-parter. So I intended right from the beginning to make this third video because I knew people would raise objections to this history and my narrative of it. Therefore, let's get on with it. For starters, many are of the opinion that Operation Keelhaul wasn't a crime. They say it was either not a crime against humanity or a war crime and was, in fact, justified. As but one example out of many, this guy said, "So Operation Keelhaul is nothing more than the safe and efficient return of 2 million Soviet citizens to the Soviet Union, not seeing the human rights crime." When I replied that shooting people who didn't want to return isn't a crime, it was also against the Geneva Convention, as the United States government told the Soviets in 1944. He replied, "Compliance equals safety, and no, shooting enemy POW rioters isn't a crime." Later he said, "Shooting rioting prisoners of war isn't against the Geneva Convention on War. Point out the article so I can check it if you're so certain." Okay, Article 2 of the 1929 Geneva Convention says, "Prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile government, but not of the individuals or formation which captured them. They shall, at all times, be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence, from insults and from public curiosity. Measures of reprisals against them are forbidden." So yes, Mr. Hans, shooting enemy prisoners, even those who are supposedly rioting, which is a very dishonest description of what happened, is a crime and is against the Geneva Convention, since they should be at all times treated humanely. And since there shall be no reprisals made against them, which is exactly what shooting and beating is, by the way, and since you have to protect them against acts of violence, I would argue that shipping them to the Soviet Union, knowing full well that they will be treated badly, is, again, against the Geneva Convention. And Julius Epstein points this out in his book. He says that while the Geneva Convention of 1929 doesn't expressly make a statement on forced repatriation, the spirit of treating prisoners right is in the text, making Keelhaul a crime. He also points out that the Geneva Convention of 1949 does recognise the concept of forced repatriation. No sick or injured prisoner of war who is eligible for repatriation under the first paragraph of this article may be repatriated against his will during hostilities. As Epstein points out, it only prevents forced repatriation before the end of hostilities. But since Operation Keelhaul started in 1944, that would apply to that year and 1945, so officially Keelhaul was a crime during 1944 and 1945. He also points out that the Geneva Convention of 1951, signed by both the United Nations and the United States, says that no contracting state shall expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Now, you might object and say these two Geneva Conventions were after Operation Keelhaul. Perhaps, although we're not so sure when Keelhaul ended. That said, the Soviet Union itself signed 27 treaties between 1918 and 1921, all of which agreed to the principle of voluntary repatriation only, and actually explicitly prohibited forced repatriation. The prisoners of war of both parties shall be set at liberty to return home, insofar as they do not desire, with the consent of the state which took them prisoners, to remain within its borders or leave for another country. So, according to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which the Soviet Union and Germany signed, prisoners could remain in the country they were captured by so long as they wished to do so. Thus, Operation Keelhaul was a violation of this treaty as well. In fact, Article 18 also says the same thing, and there were others besides. Epstein continues to list them, and comes to the conclusion that this was against both national and international law. But even if you don't accept any of these treaties, it's quite clear that this was a crime against humanity, even if the law doesn't specifically state it was. Socrates was sentenced to death by the law, which most people would decry to this day. The Turkish government doesn't recognise the Armenian genocide, therefore, by Turkish law, it didn't happen. Well, no, it did happen. The law is a load of rubbish. It's just there to protect the establishment. So something can be a crime even if it's not recognised as such by the so-called law system. Beating people, shooting people, R-ing people, and sending them back to be enslaved or executed is a crime, even if the criminal establishment, or their shills, don't recognise it as one. Of course, pointing out that the Geneva Convention says you have to treat prisoners humanely and not beat or shoot them isn't good enough, apparently. In the comments of episode 2, Ricardo said, "There was no crime at all. A crime to exist must be described before the perpetration in some written code or document. Barton fail and show us this code or document that define as a crime send back citizens to their origins place." Great English there, mate. Anyway, I replied, Article 2 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, read it. This, though, seems to have really rustled some feathers, as this guy replied, "Shut up, Tick, you are ignorant and catastrophically wrong." Which is a ridiculous counter, because that's just an emotional outburst, which is what I pointed out. Your opinion is irrelevant. Do you have a valid counter to the fact that Article 2 of the Geneva Convention makes Operation Keelhaul a crime, or are you just going to make wild and inaccurate accusations? Of course, he didn't have a valid counter. I already pointed out, in a different comment, how your call for only individual responsibility and criminal organisations is 1, wrong, and 2, self-contradictory. This is something I'll come back to later. Your positions are untenable, since my opinion, which is informed by legal and language expertise you sorely lack, is irrelevant. Why are you asking for more of it? Another self-contradiction. You don't even know what treaty ratification is, let alone what its legal consequences are, to illustrate how truly ignorant you are. It's a very, very basic point of law. None of his argument is relevant. My reply: perhaps you didn't pick up on the subtle social cue, so let me explain. Since I knew that you had no counter to the fact that Article 2 of the 1929 Geneva Convention makes it clear that you must treat prisoners humanely and that reprisals are forbidden, me asking the question was an invitation for you to apologise and admit defeat. Instead of doing that, you'll continue to argue, and you're pointing out a contradiction that doesn't actually exist. I don't care what your opinion is of the Article 2 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, because its meaning is blatantly clear and contradicts what you and Ricardo have said. Again, my question was simply to end the debate, but you're refusing to do that because your ego invested. Again, he provided no counter to this fact, and instead linked to a video calling Vlasov a Nazi collaborator, which is fine, except he fought only one battle for the Germans, then went rogue and fought against them, a fact that Stalin's shills are ignoring. Then Ricardo replied, "Your opinion is highly relevant to me. I can recognise anti-communist fake speech, but I can also recognise serious historian work. You offer both of them. By the way, not even remotely, you can put half a ton of this Keelhaul debris inside the tiny box of the Article 2. I think you achieved a size big enough to be noted by the alt-right magnates. I think they paid you a good money for this piece of, let's say, creative what if. Come on, Barton! Russian spies all over White House in Downing Street? That is Joe McCarthy speaking, not you. Actually, the vast majority of my income comes from my patrons and subscribe stars, in other words, individuals, and the rest comes from YouTube ad revenue or YouTube premium viewers. I don't get paid by any side, which is why I'm free to do videos on Allied, Soviet and Nazi crimes. In fact, regular viewers on my channel know full well that I've covered the Nazi crimes in videos like my Greek video, which was suppressed by YouTube, and is still being suppressed. And this is why it's vital that I get Patreon and subscribe star support, because without that independence, I can't do videos on sensitive topics like this or that. Now, I have to point this out because the accusation is there. I did this series because my Patreon asked me to do it. It wasn't because I was paid by some alt-right, aka left-wing organisation or something. It was because he asked me a question about this topic. Now, he might be alt-left. I don't know. I don't think so, but maybe he is. However, I'm not pandering to the guy. He, as an individual, paid me and asked me to cover this topic, so I did. Looking back on it, I technically didn't answer the final part of his question, but the point is that regardless of his political leanings, this is a historical event. Pretending that it didn't happen or pretending it wasn't a crime just because it triggers your own nationalist and socialist insecurities is the wrong thing to do. History happened, let's not deny it. And I also want to point out that I'm not shilling for the Soviets, I'm not shilling for the Allies, and I'm not shilling for the Axis, Nazi or fascist. My stance, whether you agree with it or not, is very consistent. I'm for the individual, and not for a government or state. I'm for the innocent people suffering in a particular conflict. I'm for the victims caught between the Nazi and fascist nightmare on the one hand and the Marxist fascist Soviet dystopia on the other. This is why I can point out that the Nazis arred 10 million Soviet women while the Red Army arred maybe 2 million German women, although some of them were committed by the Western Allies too. The reason I can say that is because I'm not siding with any nation. I'm siding with the individual and with history. I'm more than happy to point out Allied, Soviet and Axis crimes all day long. Doesn't bother me at all. And it shows how I'm actually very objective when it comes to this particular topic. But, of course, the fact that I'm not on your side, whichever side that is, means that I'm not objective and that I'm biased and an ideologue. Another one of my commenters said, "Used to like your channel, man, but I'm tired of the outrage history. Every single one of your videos you talk about the horrors of communism and the Soviets. I agree, the Soviets committed a lot of horrendous acts, but come on man, Americans moving Soviet citizens back into the USSR is literally state policy. Just because you consider living in the USSR a war crime does not make this a war crime on the American government. Not to mention you talking about politics throughout it constantly. I get it, you're an anti-communist. Can we just get some normal, non-biased history? Back to Dr. Felton, I guess." Technically, it was a war crime during the war. Shooting prisoners is a war crime, but because it continued until after the war, until 1947 at the earliest, I think the term crime against humanity is more apt. Secondly, it wasn't just the Americans. The British, the French, the Canadians, and possibly more besides, conducted Operation Keelhaul, and they didn't just move them back to the USSR. They beat and shot a lot of those that refused to comply. That's why it's called the forced repatriation, because of the violence that had to occur in order to get them back. Now, the question is, why were they resisting? And the answer lies in the politics. So even though a lot of the critics said I should ignore the politics, I can't ignore the politics, because the entire event is to do with politics. The reason the Soviets wanted their people back was a political reason. Every Russian who caught even a glimpse of life outside the USSR was suspected of being infected with unsound views, and if he returned, had to be isolated in a labour camp. Units of the Red Army that had merely been temporarily encircled by the German army were at once suspect. How could Stalin then feel safe with a disciplined force of 20,000 on British soil far from his control? So, what is the answer to the question, why were the prisoners resisting? Well, as many other commenters try to argue, they said that the Cossacks were all war criminals and deserved what was coming to them. It's funny you decided not to mention what these people actually did before and after the war. Here's a couple excerpts. The conflict in the Don region was ferocious. Nevertheless, it is noteworthy that much of the violence perpetrated by Krasnov while he was in control of the Don from May 1918 to February 1919 was targeted at fellow Cossacks. Estimates of the number killed range from 25,000 to 45,000. A.G. Skuro was more frank in his discussion of the matter. The Cossacks were completely without mercy toward the Red Army Jews and didn't even pay attention to documents which attested to the fact that they had been forcibly conscripted. The Cossacks were of the opinion that, given their inherent deceptiveness, the Jews could have avoided conscription had they truly wanted to. After taking a Red unit prisoner, the Cossacks would order the Yids to come forward and immediately cut down all who did. According to Skuro, Jewish Red Army soldiers would put on crosses beforehand in order to pass for Christian, but they would still be recognised by their accent. As a result, the Cossacks stopped believing the crosses and carried out their own physical inspection of the prisoners and would execute all of those who were circumcised. And so the argument goes that since these were all criminals themselves, it's okay to ship them to the Soviet Union. There's a few problems with that line of reasoning though. One, while some of the Cossacks had committed crimes, not all of them had. You're trying to argue that every single Cossack committed a crime, just like every single German committed a crime during World War II, right? No exceptions, okay? What about the women? Or the children? Even children born well after the Russian Revolution, which was over 20 years before. Should they have been sent back as well, like they were? Should the women have been arred at the border as well, even those born after 1921? If you commit a crime, should your parents be executed? What about your children? If your wife commits a crime, should you go to jail for it? No, because you didn't commit the crime. You have to punish the individual for the crime, not everyone associated with them. So yes, maybe you could argue that the criminals within the Cossacks should have been sent back, but they weren't the only ones sent back. Everyone was sent back, regardless of whether they committed a crime or not. And you're forgetting that the Soviet Union itself was a criminal organisation. It had not only seized power in one of the bloodiest coups in human history, but it also committed numerous crimes against humanity. Something often left out of the history books is the fact that the Red Army also committed crimes against the Jews. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The men from Budyonny's Red Cavalry Division stole possessions, including Jewish women's underwear, read between the lines, and tortured the men. The general himself attempted to shoot one man who threatened to report him to the higher-ups, only failing to do so when his pistol misfired. Budyonny would rise to the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union, take part in the Second World War, and die in 1973, having completely gotten away with his crimes. In other Red Cavalry units, the prettiest girls were simply taken, either in the streets or carted off first. And yes, I'm masking some of my language here to get around the censors. Despite the Bolsheviks' official repudiation of anti-Semitism, some sections of the Red Army were nevertheless responsible for pogroms as vicious as any other, in which Red officers, Red Army staff, and Soviet commissars themselves participated. There was a latent, sometimes even an open anti-Jewish sentiment in the ranks of Europe's socialist parties, and anti-Semitism did not spare Red Russia either. By the time World War II had broken out, Stalin had killed many more Jews than Hitler. And why was that? Oh, it's because Marxism itself is inherently anti-Semitic, as I have been over before in another video. So, the Soviet Union was an anti-Semitic socialist paradise. Then you have the Holodomor, which, surprise surprise, many of you will probably argue didn't happen either, or if it did, that it was a natural famine, which is simply a rubbish argument. This wasn't the first famine in the Soviet Union. Millions had starved to death during the revolution itself because Lenin's socialism was a disaster. He stole the peasants' food and exported grain to foreign countries as the peasants were left to starve. Lenin then claimed he was purchasing food from abroad, but in fact was using the people's taxes to export his violent revolution abroad. This was why he had to backtrack and introduce the NEP, because socialism had destroyed the Russian economy. People starved to death in the Soviet Union every year between 1917 and 1949. Why? Because socialism is a policy that destroys your own economy. In other words, it is an empirical fact that socialism doesn't work. By the 1980s, it was an open secret that the 2% of Soviet farmland that was privately owned was producing 30% of Russia's agricultural output. I want to read that again. In fact, I'm going to. By the 1980s, it was an open secret that the 2% of Soviet farmland that was privately owned was producing 30% of Russia's agricultural output. Private ownership is vastly superior to collective public ownership, and that is an empirical fact. But, of course, when I say that socialism doesn't work, I get accused of having an ideological bent. No, I'm going where the evidence takes me. That's not ideology. There's a mountain of empirical evidence that says that socialism doesn't work. And it's not just the Austrian school saying this, it's the Chicago school, many other economic schools as well, plus the historical facts. When I was a socialist, even I knew that having too much socialism was a bad thing. That's why I was a moderate socialist and not a communist. And I knew that too much socialism was a bad thing because the history of the Soviet Union, Cambodia, North Korea, all the others made that blatantly clear. So, I'm not arguing that socialism doesn't work from an ideological perspective, but from an empirical, historical, and praxeological perspective. I've done my homework, and I accept the facts. Many of you don't do that because you're adherents to your own ideological beliefs. By accusing me of being an ideologue when I'm not, what you're doing is providing an emotional response to empirical data that you don't like, and what you're doing is projecting your own insecurities onto me. When you have a false belief system, and reality comes and smashes it, you get triggered. That's what triggering is. You're triggered because reality doesn't conform to what you believe. And here's the thing, it doesn't take an ideology to accept the evidence, it takes an ideology to reject it. You're rejecting the evidence because your ideology, your religious faith in the wonders of impossible utopia blinds you to reality. Wake up. Robert Conquest, an outstanding British historian of the Soviet Union, was routinely pilloried by leftists for being too harsh on the Soviets and for exaggerating Soviet crimes. To this day, a few holdouts continue to deny or minimise those crimes, but by and large, Conquest has been vindicated. He was recently asked by his publisher to prepare a new edition of his book, The Great Terror, incorporating Soviet archival materials now available to scholars. They asked for a new title for the updated edition. Conquest suggested, "I told you so, you expletive deleted fools." And here's a great example. In 1943, 2 Russian sailors had deserted from their ship in a British port. A Soviet demand for their return had been firmly refused. Why? If Soviet socialism is so great, why did they flee? What's their excuse for deserting? So the point of all this is to say that the Soviet Union itself was a criminal organisation that had committed many crimes against humanity. Therefore, is it right to send criminals and non-criminals to the Soviet Union for justice? I would argue not. I think it's very hypocritical to even suggest that. Especially when you consider that the justice that they would receive was outright execution or slavery in a gulag, all of which is without a fair trial or any consideration about whether the individual had committed crimes or not. What I really enjoy is the double standards. One commenter said in reply to me that the crimes of the Cossacks were by no means individual crimes. They were directly sanctioned by the top of the leadership by people like Skuro and Krasnov, and anti-Semitism made up a core part of the reason for the White Army soldiers' reason for fighting. And to claim it was just a few bad apples is a complete whitewash of history. I replied, Budyonny wasn't punished for his crimes, and neither were Lenin, Trotsky or Stalin, or any of the other Soviet leadership. As you said, they were directly sanctioned by the top of the leadership, so why wasn't Stalin hung along with the Cossacks? The reason why, of course, is because the Soviet Union is glorious and never did anything wrong. And here's the thing, it wasn't just the Cossacks. The Allies were shipping Soviet citizens and non-Soviet citizens back as well. There were prisoners of war, including doctors and nurses, and ordinary people, women and children, who had been enslaved by the National Socialists, like what happened to the citizens of Stalingrad, who were force-marched to the trains, with many of them dying on the way, then shipped to the labour camps of the Reich. These people hadn't committed crimes, yet were now being sent to be executed or enslaved by the Soviet Union. To me, that sounds like a crime against humanity, even if the law doesn't recognise it. A great example of this is the Crimean Tatars. Hitler had originally wanted to deport the Crimean Tatars but wasn't able to do so. After the Soviets retook the area, they were forcibly deported to Siberia by the NKVD in 1944. Some Tatars had managed to escape westwards before the Red Army retook the Crimea in May 1944. Thousands were murdered by the SS, who took them for Jews. As Muslims they were circumcised. But some 250 survived to fall into the hands of the British Army in Germany. So note, these weren't cooperating with the Germans. They were being persecuted by the Germans, but still wanted to flee from the Soviet Union. If it wasn't because of socialism, I'd be curious to know why they decided to do that. Also, they were being persecuted by the NKVD. Why was that? Clearly, they were caught between the vice of two horrible socialist regimes. That's the reason why. But anyway, they fled west and then wanted to emigrate to Turkey. Instead, they were forcibly shipped back to Stalin thanks to Operation Keelhaul. So they were the victims of both the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, and yet the Allies forced them to go back to the Bolsheviks to be finished off. How is that not a crime? And how can you call the Tatars war criminals? Another major criticism of the idea of Operation Keelhaul is that all the evidence we have for it comes from people who hated the Soviet Union or the West, or are authors who are compromised in some way. The amount of people telling me that Solzhenitsyn is not a historical source tick, or that he invented the Gulag Archipelago, and that it's not a historical manuscript and is the fiction of an idiot, was insane. Now, I understand that Solzhenitsyn's book isn't perfect, but neither is any other historical source. Every word ever written by anyone was put there by human hands, which were powered by human minds. Every word is therefore biased because no human has a complete picture of the events, and if they did, if they were a god who saw everything and understood all there was to know, that would still be a bias because having all the knowledge in the universe is a bias. Every author has an agenda, be it good or bad, so just pointing out that a source is biased or has an agenda doesn't instantly mean it should be dismissed. If that was the case, you would have to dismiss every source in existence. Halder's diary was written by Halder, so it's biased and has an agenda. Zhukov wrote his memoirs, so they're biased and have an agenda. The official reports or histories of a certain topic, all written by humans who are biased and have agendas. So saying that a source has bias and an agenda is like saying that humans need to breathe. Wow, well done. And history isn't the study of the past, it's the study of the human record of the past. So Solzhenitsyn is a historical source because he wrote a record of the past. Whether that record is 100% right or 100% wrong is up for us to decide. But it is still a record of the past, and therefore is a historical source. Now, did he invent everything he wrote in the Gulag Archipelago? No. There are other sources that show that the Gulag system was a thing. As of January 1st, 1949, the MVD system included 67 independent corrective labour camps with some 10,000 camp divisions and facilities, like Puntny, and 1,734 colonies, containing 2,356,685 prisoners, of whom 1,963,679 were able-bodied workers. So, Solzhenitsyn didn't dream up the idea of the Gulag system. He may have got some of the details wrong, but that doesn't mean that we should dismiss everything he had to say. Like all memoirs, the Gulag Archipelago is a useful but also limited primary source document. We can use it, we just have to be careful when we do. But in the case of Operation Keelhaul, due to the fact that the archives remain closed, we do not have the evidence to neither confirm nor refute what Solzhenitsyn wrote about this event. So the only thing we can do is accept the account as it is for now and be prepared to change our minds when new evidence becomes available later. But notice, I'm not religiously holding on to the Gulag Archipelago as if it's some sort of holy text, nor am I dismissing it outright. Both extremes are wrong. I'm taking a more balanced view and saying, no, we use it to explain Operation Keelhaul until it's either proven or disproven later. But Solzhenitsyn wasn't the only source to be dismissed. One commenter said, "Ha! Epstein, an excellent screenwriter. Are you into the movies? And Solzhenitsyn, lol." As I said in my reply, that's a different Julius Epstein. Of course, he then went on to quote Wikipedia. Julius Epstein was a journalist and scholar, an Austrian Jewish emigre who fled Europe in 1938, worked during World War II in the Office of War Information, and then a prominent American anti-communist researcher and critic of the Soviet Union. He was a research associate at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution and Peace. In 1962, during the height of the Cold War, Epstein alleged that the Soviet Union had lost at least a dozen cosmonauts in undisclosed space disasters. Epstein claimed it was known to the US government, but the State Department did not want to embarrass the Russians by revealing it. He then says, "A wonderful source, together with Schneider, Tolstoy, Trotsky, lol, etc." So yes, he's dismissing every source I used. Every one of them. You know, and I get this all the time. I can use every source available on a topic, but yet, somehow, they're all to be dismissed. No, I've said this over and over again. You have to use every source. You cannot dismiss a source even if you think that source is wrong. If you are dismissing sources, you're not doing history right. You're doing it wrong. You have to look at history from all the different angles, and the only way you can do that is by using all the sources that you can get your hands on. That doesn't mean you have to agree with a source, but it does mean that you have to use it. Now yes, Epstein was an anti-communist. And that's great. I'm against lying, thieving, murdering scumbags too. Being an anti-communist might be a bias, but it's actually a good thing. And yes, Epstein may have waded into the lost cosmonauts debate, but that's irrelevant. Let's just say that he was completely wrong about that and that the lost cosmonauts was not a thing. It has no relevance to Operation Keelhaul. If he's wrong about one thing, that doesn't mean he's wrong about everything else. If you do a maths exam and there's 100 questions and you get one of the questions wrong, that doesn't mean your answer to every other question must have been wrong too. So dismissing Epstein just because he waded into the lost cosmonauts debate doesn't invalidate his views on Operation Keelhaul. After he dismissed every source, I replied, "But Epstein wasn't a screenwriter, as you originally claimed. He's also the guy who confirmed that the Katyn massacre was committed by the Soviets, not the Nazis, as the Soviets tried to say it was to exonerate themselves from the crime. And I like how your only counter is to deny history and dismiss sources. Nazis do that a lot too. Finally, Simplicius replied, I deny fairy tales and propaganda that you're using as a source. So notice, he got called out for lying, saying that Epstein was an excellent screenwriter. I proved he was lying, and the best he could do was dismiss Epstein's book as fairy tales and propaganda. Zero evidence to say it was fairy tales and propaganda, by the way. But where's the apology? Same with the guys before. Why is there never an apology when they're called out and proven wrong? I'll tell you why. Because these people never apologise, because they're never wrong. They're automatically right because they assume that they are the good guys. And they must be the good guys because they believe they're the good guys and are fighting for a worthy social cause. And because I no longer believe in glorious, murderous socialism, I must therefore be wrong. Thus, no matter what I say, it can just be dismissed because it doesn't matter. I must be wrong. Evidence be damned. Religious belief in the idea is all that matters. Another guy decided to dismiss yet another source of mine. Fascinating video as always and well researched, but to quote Trotsky in reference to Bolshevik Russia is beyond repute. Either you are letting your bias get the best of you, which while sometimes I disagree like this time, but keep it up. What? Or you are being deliberately misleading. Not a commie by the way, but even my layman's knowledge of history know you cannot conflate the two. Like I said, I kinda like your bias, but this is a bit too far. Okay, well I do like how Jussie replied, do you want Trotsky deleted from history? Because yes, that's what the other guy is implying. I don't like this guy, therefore he should be expunged from the historical record. But no, apparently what he meant was that he was just not quoting Trotsky in relation to a Soviet Union he had been banished from years before. So I replied, the point was to show the idea of the socialist new man, which was still a concept the Soviet Union agreed with. Lenin might have died, but his influence lived on. Trotsky might have been banished and murdered, but his influence lived on. In fact, the only source that wasn't picked on was Orwell. But the reason why is because people mistakenly believe that Orwell was a leftist, which he was, but only up until the early 1940s. By the time of the Second World War, and definitely by the end of it, I would argue that Orwell was no longer a socialist. My evidence for that is his writings like The Prevention of Literature, Animal Farm, and also 1984. Big Brother was Orwell's great antagonist in 1984. Well, what was the party of Big Brother called? INGSOC, which is English Socialism. This is where some commenters, not mentioning any names, went wrong in their assessment of Orwell. Yes, they correctly identified that Orwell had become a socialist by the Spanish Civil War, but failed to recognise that he had started to turn away from it again after he realised it wasn't quite what it seemed. He did definitely rally against communism and fascism, but the fact was that he called the party of Big Brother INGSOC, English Socialism, which is very suggestive. Plus, if you're going to call Orwell a leftist, what you're actually doing is calling him a fascist. The word Trotskyist or Trotsky fascist is generally used to mean a disguised fascist who poses as an ultra-revolutionary in order to split the left-wing forces. In Spain, to some extent even in England, anyone professing revolutionary socialism, i.e. professing the things the Communist Party professed until a few years ago, is under suspicion of being a Trotskyist in the pay of Franco and Hitler. The accusation is a very subtle one because in any given case, unless one happened to know the contrary, it might be true. A fascist spy probably would disguise himself as a revolutionary. In Spain, everyone whose opinions are to the left of those of the Communist Party is sooner or later discovered to be a Trotskyist or at least a traitor. That's right, those who are to the left of the communists are The Fascists. What's that? My political spectrum was correct yet again? All I'm doing is reporting what the Communist Party said in the late 1930s, so don't shoot the messenger. But this just goes to show how ridiculous the political situation was in the 1930s and the 1940s, and still is today. So when some commenters say it's a similar mistake to think George Orwell wrote Animal Farm as an indictment to communism when it is totalitarianism he was writing about, I think they're wrong. He was definitely against both communism and totalitarianism, but because people mistakenly believe he was always a socialist, even at the end of his life, they're not willing to criticise him. So they'll attack Solzhenitsyn, and so on, someone blatantly obviously against glorious socialism and communism, but not the socialist Orwell when he himself provided one of the greatest indictments to socialism and communism. But this leads us into more serious criticism of the narrative of Operation Keelhaul, which is that the sources are all anecdotal, or that there simply isn't enough evidence to suggest that it even happened. To highlight this, here is a comment that brings it up. Tick, I love your videos because most of the time they are unapologetically objective. As you said it yourself, you are here for history, not propaganda. But this video was not good. 4 out of 10. First of all, he goes on to describe the Cossacks as criminals, which I've already addressed, but then he says, secondly, your sources are pretty bad. For anecdotal source of Captain Anthony Smith, there are thousands of anecdotal sources of the contrary in Russia. Solzhenitsyn is not a historical source. The rest of your sources are very biased with no actual Russian sources about the events. Because Solzhenitsyn wasn't Russian apparently, and the Cossacks don't count. Imagine if someone would use only sources by German generals about World War II. Then, after another point about how the Russian Liberation Army were all brainwashed against glorious socialism, he then says, I hope in next video you will keep the high standards and will not devolve into pure one-sided propaganda like this one. History is like a court, and we are the judges. Everyone should be able to say their part and or explain context, which you did not hear. I hope my English was understandable. Your regular viewer, CA. Now, this may come as a bit of a shock to you, CA, but I actually agree with you. Partly. Yes, most of these sources are anecdotal. You say that all the sources are anecdotal, which is not true. But you are correct that most of the sources are anecdotal accounts of what happened. I think it would have helped the cause if there were more Russian accounts of what happened, but also just more accounts in general. There simply aren't enough primary sources available to historians on this topic. This is in fact the major issue which undermines the idea that Operation Keelhaul even happened. Perhaps even more shocking to you, CA, is that I would go even further. Technically, if we were to look at this objectively, because of the lack of evidence and the fact that proponents of the idea that Operation Keelhaul took place say that the evidence is all locked away in the archives and can't be touched, this actually makes this a conspiracy theory. And the historians who look into this would therefore be labelled conspiracy theorists. Bet you didn't expect me to say that. This is actually a conspiracy. A 3-volume record of the whole American-British forced repatriation operation was compiled on the 18th of September 1948, and it is titled Forcible Repatriation of Displaced Soviet Citizens Operation Keelhaul. Its secret file number is 383.7-14.1. We know that this file exists. We know where it's located. We know what it contains within it. But we cannot access it because of a conspiracy by the United States and the UK governments and more to prevent this information getting out. I've presented you plenty of information within this series from eyewitness accounts, diaries, newspapers, books, Orwell, who was a journalist at the time, and we can see that there were parliamentary debates over this. So this isn't a woo-woo magic, tinfoil hat, the aliens built the pyramids conspiracy theory. This is a genuine conspiracy theory by governments around the world to prevent you accessing certain types of information that we know exist, like the files on the Hess case, which are locked away in the Royal Archives and the Secret Services Archives, both of which are exempt from the Freedom of Information Acts and similar. Again, Rudolf Hess was a real guy, and he did fly to Scotland, etc. The problem is that the official explanation is complete garbage, and because the files are inaccessible, we're left to guess what his motivations were and what actually happened, because it's clear from the evidence that we do have that the events didn't play out the way that the British establishment said they did. Same applies with the Abwehr and Canaris. And the same thing applies to Operation Keelhaul. We know that evidence exists on Operation Keelhaul. We have anecdotal and non-anecdotal evidence of it happening, and we know that millions of Russians in Allied hands didn't just magically disappear in 1945. So we know that this event took place, but we don't know enough about it because there was a conspiracy to cover it up. Think about it. Why would the Freedom of Information Act even exist if the UK government wasn't conspiring to prevent certain information from being accessed? The very fact that the Act exists is proof that the government is conspiring against you and is not on your side. This is why one of the major criticisms of Julius Epstein and Tolstoy's books is that they only used a handful of accounts to compile a picture of what happened. Now, there is a book I wasn't able to get a hold of, which was a book by Christopher Booker titled A Looking Glass Tragedy. This book is actually about the Bleiburg massacre, which is the forced repatriation of Croatian soldiers and civilians who were handed back over to Tito's communists and then slaughtered. I haven't covered this because I didn't know if it came under Operation Keelhaul or was a separate issue. But, according to Wikipedia, Booker criticised Tolstoy's version of what happened, basically saying that he was relying on 3 partial eyewitness accounts 40 years afterwards. On the one hand, this wasn't good. But on the other, what else was he meant to do? It has since come to light that the Bleiburg massacres not only occurred, but the information had been suppressed by the Yugoslav government for decades. And many commenters were saying I should do a video on the topic, so maybe I will at some point, but I'm hopeful that the future collapse of the British and United States governments will finally allow access to the information contained in their archives. I have another history book that I haven't mentioned yet in this series, which is Savage Continent by Keith Lower. Interestingly, he talks about the displaced persons in Germany after the war, describing how the victims of Nazism were forced back into their concentration camps by the Allies so as to keep order and process them for repatriation. He also briefly mentions the Soviets wanting to repatriate their citizens, but unlike with other nationalities, he offers no details because he can't. Again, we know this event took place, but the sources are under lock and key. All this is to say that the biggest problem with Operation Keelhaul is the lack of sources due to the policies of the governments of the Western world to hide those sources from us, to prevent us from knowing more about the crimes they committed. Until the archives are opened, we're left to guess at what truly happened. So I actually agree with you, CA. Most of the sources we have are anecdotal. However, I disagree with you when you apologise for the crimes against the Cossacks, for reasons I mentioned before, and I also disagree with you when you say that there are contrary accounts in Russia. This isn't just about Russia, it's about the West as well. You said, imagine if someone would use only sources by German generals about World War II. Okay, so imagine if I only used Russian accounts for what the Allies did. For the same reason, that would also be wrong. The West committed this crime. The West cannot deny that its soldiers beat and shot civilians and prisoners of war that were in their hands. Russian accounts are irrelevant when it comes to that. I also disagree when you say that this was propaganda. Whose propaganda? All the Western Allies, and the Soviets as well, were involved in this crime. The propaganda says that this event didn't happen. So you, by apologising for the crime, and you saying that it didn't happen or downplaying it, etc., are the one who's believing the pure one-sided propaganda. If history is a court and we are the judges, then I'm judging you and saying stop apologising for the crimes that the criminal governments are making. All of them. The UK, the United States, the EU, the Soviet Union, the Russian government, the Nazis, China, whatever. Stop apologising for them. All the governments are the same. They're all criminals. They're all pumping propaganda at you 24/7 and you're just eating it all up and not questioning it. What I really like about this series is that the vast majority of my critics, most of them being Russian, have simultaneously accused me of irrationally hating the glorious Soviet Union, which it isn't, whilst also loving the Western governments and believing their propaganda. No, I don't love the Western governments, I don't believe their propaganda, and this is as much an Allied crime as it is a Soviet crime. And this is the weird part about this, most of my critics weren't trying to defend the actions of the Allies. In fact, I have given you the one and only comment that actually did that. The rest were trying to defend the Soviet Union. And I think that speaks volumes. You're accusing me of being brainwashed. Yet I'm not the one apologising for my government, because it's not my government. The government owns me, I don't own it. As a serf, I have to pay my taxes to the benefit-scrounging lords and ladies. So I'm not on the side of those criminal scum. Meanwhile, you're sat there crying, saying that the Russian government never did anything wrong. No, it absolutely did. Who's the one who's brainwashed? You are. Who's the one who's got a political ideology? You have. Who's the one who's not being objective? You are. You're sat there like a good little serf justifying the crimes of your masters. And in this case, you're justifying the crimes of my masters as well, even though you've been programmed to hate my masters. And that contradiction, your need to love your establishment whilst also hating the Western establishment, even though both cooperated in this crime, is why you got triggered by my videos on Operation Keelhaul and why your arguments don't make sense. Your love for the Russian government and the Soviet Union and glorious socialism has led you to deny an Allied crime. Just stop and think about that for a second. When you have a contradiction, that contradiction shows that something is wrong with your narrative. And there is something wrong with nationalism. People spend their entire lives ego-investing themselves in their own nation. And I had several commenters saying how disgusted they were by their own nation. Guys, it's not your nation. You don't own it. It's not you. There's a difference between the individual and the state. You are not part of the state, and you are not part of the nation. If you believe you are no different from the communists or the fascists. No, you are an individual, and when you accept that you are nothing more than an individual and that everyone around you are individuals, then you will see the world for how it really is. That government that you worship is actually a bunch of individuals who are conspiring to get more power over you, and then justify why they are entitled to reach into your pocket and help themselves to your wallet. And you've fallen for it, just like I did. You're giving up your individual authority to the authority of other individuals, and willingly so, because you mistakenly believe that they're going to help you. They have put you in a cage, and to get out of that cage, you need to show your papers, your passport. But yeah, I'm the ideologue for wanting to break down the bars on my cage. So, apart from the fact that the sources remain locked away by the despots, I think I've addressed most of the counter-arguments against Operation Keelhaul. I'm sure there will be more criticism over this video, and I look forward to reading your comments, good or bad. And if I have to follow this one up with another video to address more criticism, I will, but I'll see what the counter-arguments are first. If they're all just rehashing the same arguments I've just addressed, I'll not bother. But if there is something new, then I might. Either way, thanks for watching, bye for now.